One of the arguments that in the late 1980s brought about the mandatory shall issue permit to avoid that. Now, since we have that, after we did the mandatory shall issue everywhere, including Philadelphia, after 17 came in, we also saw sheriffs wanting to use that list of carry permit holders to solicit campaign contributions. I seem to recall that got a lot of adverse reactions for a sheriff. One of the problems that you've got here, you talk about reporting the 3,100 from Florida. The exercise of a constitutional right shouldn't be a matter for public discussion. It doesn't make any difference what good book a person carries, whether it's a Torah, a Bible, or a Quran, or a prayer wheel. That's their right of conscience. The person who chooses to associate with bad guys, well, you got to take a look. Is it somebody who's actively involved in the drug trade? My good friend Brad Richmond, who handles the carry permit cases for Philadelphia, does this presentation about the street-level drug dealer and the muscle man who has the carry permit. Well, if the gentleman, the muscle with the carry permit, is involved in street trade, I keep telling Mr. Richmond, have him arrested. It's called conspiracy. If you can't make out the case to charge him and prosecute him, then you should say, okay, he's an innocent person and is entitled to all the rights and privileges of a citizen. If you can't arrest the person, if you can't put it on the record, then don't use innuendo, defamation to say, oh, you're not one of the people we want to have a carry permit. Because, I'm sorry, gentlemen, you're elected officials and you're our representatives. But you still operate in a system where the government is a restricted government. You are not omnipotent. You just heard a DA sit here and say, well, we'd love you to give us the power to arrest these people. For what? For exercising constitutional rights?
Thank you, Councilor. I think the DA said that he'd love to have that authority, but it would violate people's rights, and they're not.
He also invited the change in the statute.
But just to clarify,
Okay.
I'm not doing his bidding.
No offense to Mr. Ray.
I can take care of myself.
You made three statements that seem to be a bit contradictory. At times during your testimony, you took a position opposite Representative Lentz, and at times you seemed to be perhaps even running to the left of Mr. Lentz. And I didn't see his interview on Fox 29 this morning, but it sounds like you may have recited some of the lines that he used. So I'd like to give you a chance to maybe clarify your testimony, or at least help me understand exactly where you're coming from. You began in your testimony talking about perhaps it being okay for non-violent drunks to get a permit. Is that your testimony?
No, the point I was making, and the testimony in front of the State Select Committee that we had.
Right. But this is the House Judiciary Committee.
I understand.
So I'll just ask you about your comments today.
Okay, and I'm trying to answer that.
Right.
The testimony we had in front of the State Select Committee was that just because someone has a drinking problem doesn't mean they're a violent person. Not all drunks are violent.
Sure.
Okay. The problem that you've got, the gentleman who goes to the bar all the time, if they're not having all sorts of encounters with the police where they're at least getting arrested for drunken disorderly, so that you've got some sort of prosecution and conviction record, well, then maybe they're not the problem.
So that individual, the gals at the bar,
The guy that goes to the bar,
drinking, stumbling out of the bar at 2 o'clock.
No, the guy who's stumbling out of the bar is going to have the drunken disorderly arrest and the drunken disorderly
But absent
conviction.
that arrest, if the local sheriff is aware that, this is the guy who's at the bar every night till 2 in the morning, getting loaded, walking home, whatever. Let's say they're not even getting in a car, walking home.
Okay.
That's okay to have the concealed carry permit.
Is he going to have a situation where that individual has any kind of run-in with the law, or is he a peaceful drunk, or a peaceful alcohol imbiber? Because you can drink and not be drunk.
So peaceful drunk.
I'm saying a
have
peaceful
permit,
citizen.
but violent drunk, no.
I'm saying a peaceful citizen isn't the problem. As we just
A peaceful drunk citizen is not the problem.
You keep adding drunk, and if you
It's your testimony.
Okay, and if you want to take a look at the standard, Florida standard, habitual drunkard can't have a permit. When we did Act 17, which came out to be Section among others, section 6105, that was one of the issues we had to consider. So we decided 3 DUI arrests. If you were drinking and you had 3 DUI arrests within 5 years, you had a problem and you had a disability. You couldn't have a gun.
Maybe it should be whiskey versus beer.
Throw in wine, red wine, white wine.
Well,
But that brings us to one of the problems, where you start this, what is the standard of review? Which is where I was trying to go to begin with.
okay. The second comment you made, and I wrote this down as you said it, quote, if prohibited in Pennsylvania, then you're going to be prohibited in Florida to get a permit.
Yes.
You actually agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Explain then the aforementioned 3,100 permit holders who were able to secure a permit in Florida but not here in Pennsylvania.
I don't know if they applied, and I don't know that they did not secure a permit here. I do know that there are people who have out-of-state permits that when they have an encounter with Pennsylvania law enforcement, one in particular here in Philadelphia, where they confiscate the out-of-state permit, they confiscate the gun, they tell the gentleman, well, if you want your gun back, sue us, and they report an incident to the out-of-state issuing state.
But you truly believe that if you're going to be
They report the
prohibited,
incident to the issuing state, which then revokes the permit. That individual now has to go to that issuing state
right.
and contest the revocation.
Okay, but you believe that if you're going to be denied in Pennsylvania, then you're going to be denied a permit in Florida?
Yes.
Wow, okay. The third statement that you made was, as a lawyer, you testified that you're a lawyer and represent clients on these types of matters. If they have an out-of-state permit, you would counsel them not to carry here in Pennsylvania?
No.
With that out-of-state permit?
When their Pennsylvania permit has been revoked, I would counsel them not to carry on the out-of-state permit until we address the revocation.
But how then would you have an out-of-state permit if you're not able to get an in-state permit, since in that...
No, they had an in-state permit, it was revoked. They had an out-of-state permit, they've got the in-state permit, the out-of-state permit.
Okay.
The in-state permit is
So
revoked.
let's just take a simple hypothetical. You have a Pennsylvania permit, it gets revoked. You go to Florida, you get a permit, you would then counsel your client not to carry in Pennsylvania. based
I've
on
never
the
had that
Florida permit.
situation in the 30 years I've been doing this
But
stuff.
you would counsel them not to do that?
I've never had that situation presented. I would need
Then
to find,
why testify then that you would counsel them not to carry it?
what I counseled them was, you have a Pennsylvania permit, the scenario was, you have a Pennsylvania permit and a Florida permit or a sister state reciprocal permit. The Pennsylvania permit is revoked. I counsel them not to carry on their out-of-state, the reciprocal permit, until they address the revocation.
Doesn't that sort of run contradictory then to the second statement I read of yours, that if you're going to be prohibited in Pennsylvania, you're likely going to be prohibited, you are going to be prohibited in other states?
Just
How would-
because you revoke doesn't mean you're prohibited. It's when the revocation is upheld. As I said, I've seen revocations that were absolutely ludicrous.
Do you think we should have a system that if you get revoked in Pennsylvania, then if you have an out-of-state permit, let's say you're carrying 2 permits, you should have your Florida permit revoked as well? Since at the beginning of the process, since at the beginning of the process, you testified that if you're going to be prohibited in Pennsylvania, you're going to be prohibited in Florida. Do you believe then that if you're revoked in Pennsylvania, it should be automatic revocation for Florida as well?
No.
It would seem to be consistent then
If I
with
may-
your earlier statement.
If you are revoked in Pennsylvania, it is my understanding that that revocation gets reported to a sister state, a reciprocal state that's giving you a carry permit. That sister state then gets to make the determination because it's their carry permit issuance.
So there it becomes a different standard.
No, it's still that sister state. Now, the revocation here in Pennsylvania, okay, give you an example. If you are convicted of a drug case, any drug conviction, you can't get a carry permit. Even if you're driving a family car and there's a roach in the car and it's not really clear who got the roach there because there's lots of people in the family, but the driver takes the $25 hit, says, minor personal use possession, $25 fine. Now, 6109 says they can't have a permit. But the guy who sits there and says, oh gee, I'm addicted to marijuana, put me into a drug treatment program and goes through section 17 and has their drug case revoked, they can get a permit.
Would you support, if your permit has been revoked in Pennsylvania, having all other state permits that have an issue to that individual revoked as well?
It's my understanding,
Just yes or no?
it is my understanding that if you have a permit in Pennsylvania and it is revoked, when that report goes out, the other states, reciprocal states, are notified of the revocation.
Right, but they still have the rights, you're saying. I'm just asking your opinion. Do you think it should be revoked as well, or should you be able to keep that other state's permit?
I think it's up to the other state to decide what they want to do. It's their permit.
Right.
Now, as far as Pennsylvania is concerned, some of the revocations are absurd.
Okay. I appreciate your perspective on Pennsylvania's system, and we are going to get into that more. I just think your logic, respectfully, is quite flawed in terms of whether it's the entry point or the exit point on either getting the permit or revoking the permit. Part of your testimony is that it's the same standards. Other part of your testimony conveniently allows it to be left up to the other state. And I just don't.
Just because
Maybe I need to take your CLE, because I don't think where you're coming from.
We have had state reps and we all have had public officials take it. And on top of that, we have had ATF counsel presenting it. We have had state police counsel presenting it. And it's an enlightenment because there's a lot of misconceptions, one of which is what we're talking about. Because this is, quote unquote, great issue. As I said, when you have an instance here in Pennsylvania where somebody with an out-of-state permit encounters Pennsylvania law enforcement, that law enforcement reports to the issuing state, the reciprocal state, and they make a determination what to do because it's their permit. Just like if we have somebody who gets stopped for a traffic stop in Pennsylvania and they're driving on a Nevada license or a California license, should we revoke that license? No, we can't do that because
let's ask it this way then. Since we can't tell Florida what to do, now you're making a states' rights argument.
well, that's what you're doing. That's what you're asking about.
Convenient in your logic, but what about Pennsylvania then just not recognizing Florida's permit if Pennsylvania has already revoked the Pennsylvania permit? Would you support that?
Why?
Because Pennsylvania.
I'm missing the
I'm going to
gist of your
explain the
problem.
point. Pennsylvania has made the determination, in your hypothetical, to revoke a permit. I then
Okay.
asked you what happens to the Florida permit. You said that's up to Florida. Okay, we'll allow you to use the states' rights argument on that end of your argument. So we allow Florida to make their determination as to whether or not they want to revoke their permit. Regardless of what Florida decides, I'm in Pennsylvania. I think Pennsylvania law should govern. Should we then allow Pennsylvania to determine whether or not it wants to recognize Florida's permit under your hypothetical where Pennsylvania has already revoked the Pennsylvania permit?
Okay, now,
Yes or no?
my question to you. because
No.
No, because
I get to ask the questions.
Okay, but I need to find out what your question is. Fair enough, it's your scenario, but you haven't given me enough
It's
information.
your scenario.
No, you're saying the revocation, and I was saying, what's the basis for the revocation? When the
All right.
person came to me, I wanted to find out what the basis for the revocation was.
Okay, here's the deal. John Doe has a permit to carry concealed from Pennsylvania. John Doe also has a permit to carry concealed from Florida. He has two permits. It was from your example before. Following your hypothetical, his Pennsylvania permit has been revoked. And we all agree that it should be revoked. Okay, so there's no question as to the fact that it was revoked. It was a valid reason. He now has a Florida permit to carry concealed. I asked you whether or not Florida should then be required to revoke that. You testified that it's a states' rights issue, leave that up to Florida to make its determination. So I now come back to you and ask you, should Pennsylvania not recognize that Florida permit, given the fact that Pennsylvania has already revoked the permit from that holder?
Has Florida, and this is where I was asking for the additional information from your scenario, has that sister reciprocal state reviewed the revocation and said it's a valid revocation
Sure,
or
they
not?
reviewed it and they determined that they were not going to revoke it.
And they determined that it was not a